Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of my Cedar Point Recreation Park. We have been hard at work building some coaster stations lately, but I decided to take a little bit of a break from that today. They're all pretty large projects, so I decided to tone it down a little bit today and take a look at some of these smaller rides that normally don't get quite as much attention but are still very important. And we're starting up front with the Midway carousel. If you recall, we built a lot of these shoestrung flat rides way back in the earlier episodes, and it's finally time to give them some station buildings of their own. Carousels are difficult in particular because RCT doesn't necessarily play well with round structures like we have here, and you have to get creative with using some straight and diagonal pieces and some track architecture to get something that looks pretty nice. I spent a bit of time looking at some inspiration for some carousels that people have built in the past. I got a few good suggestions from those, but none of them were quite exactly what I came up with in the end. I think part of my problem here is that my carousel wound up being quite large compared to some of the reference screenshots I found. I also noticed it's a bit large for the Midway too, as it definitely takes up the whole width of the path here. So now I'm thinking to myself, do I need to make this carousel a lot smaller? Especially after I spent all the time building the station for it. Maybe I'll have to do that. I'm not really sure. It does look a bit big. But I do think I like where I wound up with the track architecture roof and the columns and everything. It's not the most complex station building, but considering this is going to be one of the first rides you see when you open up the park, I do want it to look as nice as I can to give a good first impression. So this might be one I'll have to play around with, experimenting a bit more later and seeing if a smaller ride is going to look better compared to the park around it. Maybe after we get some more of these buildings built up, we'll have some good context for what things look like. Especially since with real life parks, you have lots of large areas where it's just path and no buildings. And you see a lot of that by Lakeside Midway, for example, and Kitty Kingdom, where you have just large open areas and it doesn't look very interesting. So making larger rides like this that aren't necessarily to scale might help alleviate some of that. But like I said, I'm gonna have to do some experimentation, see what I like, see how things pan out. This was a relatively simple build, as most of these flat rides wind up being as soon as I settle on a design. So I'm not gonna really mind too much if I have to tear it down and rebuild it on a smaller scale. But I'll let this one sit for a bit, see how I feel after coming back to it later on. Gotta head on back through the park and hit up all the flat rides that we passed by. Next up is Ocean Motion, one where we built way back as well. And we threw down some foliage and scenery for that ride a bit already, but definitely needs a bit of sprucing up. But I'm quite pleased with what happened here. The pirate-themed lamps are a really great fit for the queue here. They match what's in real life pretty well, so I'm pretty happy with the way that turned out. It's a bit cramped over here as the real ride is on a bit of an angle, so it has a little bit more room to breathe, but we can't do that. So we're a bit too close to the buildings next door. I think that's going to be okay though. Like I said before, we're already going to have too much open space as it is with some of the empty fields and path areas, so having things a little bit crammed together isn't a big problem for me. Speaking of some of the areas around the rides, I am starting to add in some of the foliage, as you probably noticed with a lot of our coaster builds. And I did say way back when I was discussing the project plan in the Steel Vengeance episode that I was going to save foliage for its own phase, but it's looking like that phase is going to be pretty short. It's really hard for me to resist adding in the trees around the rides where it is appropriate, as I think it really helps things look nice already, and it's not really going to hurt anything to place them right away. Trees are of course very easy to delete and replace if we need to, so I'm not really concerned about that. So might help for getting things done a little bit quicker. Next up, I decided to move along to Kitty Kingdom. I put down a bunch of fences for these way back when we built these rides originally, but we're missing a lot of extra decorations around. Many of these rides have little umbrella tops on them that I tried to replicate here with some wooden coaster track. In real life, these umbrella things rotate when the rides are running. Unfortunately, we can't do that here with the track architecture. But I think it's a pretty minor issue. I don't think it's going to be a big loss if we just keep them stationary. I think they look already pretty good. I'm a little bit concerned about replacing some of the queues already with proxy path here. I've heard that if you do it in large areas of path like this, it can lead to some guest pathfinding issues. So hopefully that doesn't become a huge problem going forward, but we shall see. I want to get as much of this done as I can now so I don't have to keep coming back and revisiting things for things like just replacing the queue. It is nice that now that we have most of the rides in the park open, we have a pretty substantial amount of guests. We've been fluctuating between 2,000 to 3,000 guests in the park lately. So Kitty Kingdom is pretty populated, and it's fun to see some guests actually riding on these rides. I don't really have much to talk about with some of these individual rides. Just a lot of little to-do notes that I've had sitting around for a while, like adding the little cross beams on Tiki Twirl. It is nice to go and clean up some of the to-dos on my list that I've had sitting around for a while, and get some of the parts of the park cleaned up that have been needing it for a while. Lakeside Midway is really starting to look complete now, as we've gotten more of these ride infrastructure parts built out and more foliage and things. Finally, moving back into Planet Snoopy, we had a couple cleanup items for here as well. Been meaning to fix up the miniature railroad for a while so that the figure 8 was centered. Didn't leave quite as much room for the station, but I think that's okay. But yeah, we're just adding in some more railings here. A little bit of covering for some station builds. Some foliage. Just the usual stuff. I am leaving for later a couple extra details like the rock formation in the center here and some benches, signs, things like that that we're going to put in as part of a later phase. I know I did just say with Kitty Kingdom that I want to get these parts of the park complete when I can, but I did do this part of the episode last and was starting to get a little bit tired and it was getting late. But I can tell that the Planet Snoopy area is really starting to turn out nice, especially once we replace the path over here with the crazy paving. In real life, I think this area has more of a brick walkway than tarmac. Unfortunately, our CT2 doesn't have a built-in brick texture for paths, but the crazy paving is one of my favorite path types, and I think it looks really nice, and it's a good enough substitute for the bricks. Helps set the area apart a little bit and makes things look really nice. So I'm quite happy with the way this turned out. It is, in real life, quite a nice looking part of the park too. If you don't have any kids, you've probably never wandered over into this area, because there's not a lot for you here, if you're here mostly to ride the roller coasters. But just looking at the street view photos, it is quite nice, and I think my replica here is one of my favorite parts of the park now. I guess it helps that it's one of the most built out parts so far. Of course, I'm really looking forward to getting some of these buildings built in as well. Replace some of these red grids with some nice looking stuff as well. Of course, that's going to help. But anyway, I think that's going to do it for today. Not a lot of life-changing stuff going on here. But as I said, these are still important rides to get built. I think a lot of little details like this are really going to help the park as a whole look as good as it can. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, if you've got any comments, questions, or suggestions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.